What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 6.
Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over every position and give you my 2019 fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 6. This should help you decide who you want to start in your season-long fantasy football leagues. And we will show you how to use the Draft Dashboard tools to make better fantasy football picks. You can find waiver wire targets, get player point projections, find the best positional matchups to see who is projected to score the most fantasy points this week. These tools will help you decide what players to start in your fantasy football lineups. We have it all right here, so let's get into it. Okay guys, fantasy football week 6, sit 'em, start 'em at the quarterback position. So the first guy you got to get in your lineups if you've got him on your roster, I'm starting Matt Ryan from the Atlanta Falcons playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have the second worst defense overall, and they give up the third most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Matt Ryan's been on fire, scoring 24, 16, and 33 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He's averaging 22.9 fantasy points per game on the season, so he's been super consistent. He's projected at 19 fantasy points here in week 6, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 52 points scored in this game. He's got a great matchup versus the Arizona Cardinals. The Falcons are favored by 2. I think Matt Ryan and Julio Jones go off this week, so I'm definitely starting Matt Ryan here in week 6. On the other side of the ball, I'm starting Kyler Murray from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the third worst defense overall and give up the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Kyler Murray has averaged 20.3 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 25 fantasy points last week. He's getting an average of 5.6 rushes per game. He rushed the ball 10 times last week. This guy seems to know when to run and when to pass. He's really smart with those rushing attempts. He's projected at 17.8 fantasy points here in week 6. There's that 52 point implied total in this game. I think both quarterbacks are going to get it done here. This is a home game, so I'm definitely starting Kyler Murray here in week 6. I love the 2 quarterbacks from that game. Another guy that I'm starting this week is Teddy Bridgewater from the New Orleans Saints playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have the 8th worst defense overall, and they give up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Teddy Bridgewater has scored 14.8 fantasy points per game on the season, but he had 28 fantasy points last week, so he's heating up and connecting with his wide receivers. He gets an average of 3.3 rush attempts per game. He got 5 rush attempts last game, so it's great to see your quarterback running the ball. 1 point for every 10 yards, that really adds up. He's projected at 14.8 fantasy points here in week 6. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, and they have Jacksonville favored by 1. I think Teddy Bridgewater and Michael Thomas continue their momentum from last week, so I'm starting Teddy Bridgewater here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Another quarterback I'm starting this week is Kirk Cousins. This guy might even be available in your league. He hasn't done much so far, but he put up 21 fantasy points last week, and it looks like their offense is finally getting right. He's got a decent matchup this week versus the Philadelphia Eagles, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing quarterbacks. This is a home game for Kirk Cousins. He's projected at 15.7 fantasy points here in week 6. I think we see more fireworks from Kirk Cousins and his wide receivers, so I'm starting Kirk Cousins here in week 6. Okay, now let's take a look at the players that I want to sit here in week 6. I'm going to sit Andy Dalton. If I got another option, I'm going to go with it. Andy Dalton has only averaged 16.4 fantasy points per game on the season. He did have 19 fantasy points last week, but most of that came in the second half. It was looking really bad, but he turned it on in the second half. But this guy's got a really low floor. He put 5 fantasy points up the game before last week, so he's a scary fantasy player to have on your roster. He doesn't rush the ball much. He's touchdown dependent. He doesn't have AJ Green at his disposal. This week he's facing a Baltimore defense that's a little bit better than their stats give him credit for. They're middle of the pack defending quarterbacks, but the Baltimore Ravens are favored by 11 points here, which would mean a passing game script for Andy Dalton, but that just could mean 3 interceptions against this Baltimore defense. I don't trust Andy Dalton right now, so I'm going to sit Andy Dalton here in week 6. Another guy that I'm going to sit is Joe Flacco from the Denver Broncos. He's playing the Tennessee Titans, who have the 7th best defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Joe Flacco has only averaged 13.9 fantasy points so far in the season. He only put up 9 fantasy points last week. He had a 6 a couple of games before that. He doesn't rush the ball much. This guy just doesn't look good. Vegas only thinks there's going to be 38.5 points scored in this game, so that's a low-scoring game. They do think the Denver Broncos are going to win this game by 2.5. That's a little bit surprising to me, but it is a home game for Denver, so that's probably why they're favored. But I'm going to sit Joe Flacco here in week 6. So another guy that I'm going to sit who's had some pretty good success recently, but he didn't have a good game last week, and now he's got a bad matchup. I'm going to sit Marcus Mariota versus that Denver Broncos defense that's 8th overall, and they give up the 3rd least fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Marcus Mariota has averaged 17 fantasy points per game on the season, but he only scored 9 fantasy points last week. He rushes the ball 4.4 times per game, but he's in a tough matchup versus Denver this week, and he's only projected to get 14.5 fantasy points here in week 6. So there's a low total on this game. Vegas only thinks they're going to score 38.5 points. So I'm going to sit Marcus Mariota just due to the poor matchup here in week 6.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $100 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won,
and then we'll send you $100 PayPal.
So it's that easy,
and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video.
So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay guys, week 6 fantasy football starts and sits for the running back position. So of course you're starting guys like Ezekiel Elliott, Dalvin Cook. I'm not covering those picks here. You know those are studs. You know you should be starting them. Don't get cute and try to fade them because of a bad matchup like Dalvin Cook versus the 4th overall Philadelphia Eagles. Don't sit Dalvin Cook. Don't be that guy. So we're talking about the starts right now. So I'm starting Mark Ingram from the Baltimore Ravens playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have the 6th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Mark Ingram is averaging 16.9 fantasy points per game on the season. I think that's a big surprise to a lot of people. He scored 12 fantasy points last game. He put up a big 34 fantasy points a couple games ago. He's averaging 14.8 rushes per game on the season. He put up 19 rush attempts last week, so that's real promising to fantasy owners. It's nice to see that volume. He's projected at 12.3 fantasy points here in week 6. He's got a fantastic matchup versus the Cincinnati Bengals. He should be able to gash them on the ground. He'll get plenty of red zone targets, rush attempts at the goal line, plenty of chances to score. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, and they have Baltimore favored by 11. So I'm starting Mark Ingram here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Another guy I'm going to start, despite a bad matchup this week, is Leonard Fournette from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the New Orleans Saints. Their defense overall is not that great, but they give up the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. Leonard Fournette has averaged just about 16 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 22 fantasy points last week, 26 the game before that. They're getting Leonard Fournette rolling. He's averaging 19 rush attempts per game on the season. He got 23 rush attempts last game, 29 the game before that. He's on the field for 91% of the snaps, and he touches the ball right about 40% of the time. Monster usage for Leonard Fournette, who's finding his running legs this season. He's projected at 16.1 fantasy points here in Week 6. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game. They have Jacksonville favored by 1. This is a home game, so I'm starting Leonard Fournette here versus the New Orleans Saints. Another guy who people have been down on this year, for good reason, but I'm still starting Le'Veon Bell from the New York Jets playing the Dallas Cowboys. The Cowboys have a good defense overall, but they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Le'Veon Bell has averaged 14.2 fantasy points per game on the season. That's not terrible. He scored 12 fantasy points last game. He's getting 17.8 targets per game and 8 pass targets per game. That's what's saving his fantasy production. He got 9 targets last game. He's on the field for 94% of the snaps and touches the ball 44% of that time. He's projected at 14.8 fantasy points here in Week 6. He's got a good positional matchup here versus the Cowboys. It's a home game, and this guy's the bell cow. He's got a safe floor and a huge ceiling, so I'm starting Le'Veon Bell here versus the Dallas Cowboys. Okay, now for a guy that's been flying under the radar. I'm starting Joe Mixon from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Baltimore Ravens, who have the 10th worst defense overall and give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Joe Mixon has only averaged 8.6 fantasy points per game on the season, but he scored 11 fantasy points last week. He looked really good, but then the Bengals got behind and were forced to pass the ball. But Joe Mixon came out with a bang that first quarter. He's averaging 13.2 rushes per game on the season. He got 19 rushes last game. He gets 3.2 pass targets per game. He's projected at 13.8 fantasy points here in Week 6. There's that 48-point implied total by Vegas for this game. It's a nice running matchup versus the Baltimore Ravens. Andy Dalton and the Bengals just look really bad. Mixon is their lone bright spot, so I think they game plan to get him involved. So I'm starting Joe Mixon here versus the Baltimore Ravens. Another guy who I've been liking every week, I'm starting Carlos Hyde from the Houston Texans playing the Kansas City Chiefs, who have the 11th worst defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Carlos Hyde has averaged 9.3 fantasy points per game on the season. He got 12 fantasy points last week off of 21 rush attempts. He's averaging 14.6 rush attempts per game on the season. He's on the field for 53% of the snaps, and he touches the ball 45% of that time. So he's getting the ball when he's on the field. He's projected at 10.2 fantasy points here in Week 6. And there's supposed to be 55.5 points scored in this game. Tons of scoring projected by Vegas for this one. Carlos Hyde should get a piece of that. I think he's a great flex play this week if you're struggling to find that last spot in your roster. So I'm starting Carlos Hyde here versus the Kansas City Chiefs. Okay, now for the Week 6 fantasy football running back sits. This is hard to do. And don't do it unless you got other talent at this position. But if you're trying to decide between a couple of running backs, I'm going to sit Phillip Lindsay here versus the Tennessee Titans. The Titans have the 7th best overall defense, and they give up the 7th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. Phillip Lindsay is averaging 14.7 fantasy points per game on the season, and he scored 23 fantasy points last week. He seems to have a good week, then a bad week, a good week, then a bad week. So in this bad matchup, I'm betting on the bad week from Phillip Lindsay. The Tennessee Titans are tough to run the ball on, and there's that low 38.5 projected points in this game. Just not enough points on the board. I'm worried about Phillip Lindsay in this one. So I'm going to sit Phillip Lindsay, if I can afford to do that, here in week 6. Another guy that's been hot recently that I'm going to sit in week 6 is Jordan Howard from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 5th best defense overall and give up the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. Jordan Howard has averaged 12.5 fantasy points per game on the season, but most of those came from his 31 fantasy points he had last week. He scored 12 fantasy points this week. He's only getting an average of 10.6 rushes per game, so he's a touchdown-dependent running back who can be really scary and have a super low floor, but he's been hot recently. But I'm not going to fall into the trap of playing him here versus a good run defense in the Minnesota Vikings. I'm not going to play him just hoping to get a touchdown because he could put up 4 fantasy points here this week. 40 rush yards with no touchdowns. I can see that happening. So I'm going to sit Jordan Howard here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Another guy who I'm going to sit is the other running back from Philadelphia, Emmanuel Sanders. He's had some action recently, but he's been pushed back in the depth chart because of the emergence of Jordan Howard. He's facing that tough Minnesota Vikings run defense, only getting an average of 10.8 rushes per game, which could be coming down a little bit. He's projected at 10.1 fantasy points here in week 6. There's a low implied total, only 44 points scored in this game. I think this guy's too risky, especially with Jordan Howard getting more action. So I'm going to sit both these running backs, Jordan Howard and Emmanuel Sanders, here in week 6. Okay guys, if you're getting any value from this video, please hit that red subscribe button. We put out new fantasy football videos every day. So if you hit that subscribe button and ring that bell notification, you won't miss out on any of our new fantasy football videos. Tons of free stuff coming your way. It only takes a second, and it helps us push out more fantasy football content for you guys to consume each and every day. It's because of you subscribers that make this possible. So thank you for supporting this channel. Okay, week 6, fantasy football, stardom, sit-em, wide receiver position. He was on our stardom list last week, and he's definitely on this list again. I'm starting Michael Thomas from the New Orleans Saints playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have the 8th worst defense overall, and they give up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Michael Thomas is averaging 19 fantasy points per game on the season. He exploded for 36 fantasy points last week. He's averaging 11 targets per game. He got 13 targets last game. I love the Teddy Bridgewater to Michael Thomas connection. Thomas is projected at 14.8 fantasy points here in week 6. I don't have to say any more about this guy. He's probably an obvious start at this point. So I'm starting Michael Thomas versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. I guess he goes along with the DeAndre Hopkins, Julio Jones, Amari Cooper, Cooper Kupp. Those guys are guys that are must starts every week right now. So let's get into some of the other guys. I'm starting DeMarcus Robinson from the Kansas City Chiefs playing the Houston Texans, who have the 11th worst defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. DeMarcus Robinson has averaged 10.9 fantasy points per game on the season. He's had a rough couple of weeks, only 5 and 6 fantasy points the last couple of weeks. He's averaging 5.4 targets per game. He got 6 and 9 targets in those last 2 games. So that's pretty good volume. He's on the field for 86% of the snaps and only touching the ball 9% of the time right now. So that number can come up. He's projected at 9.3 fantasy points here in week 6. But remember, Vegas thinks there's going to be 55.5 points scored in this game, and they have Kansas City favored by 5. This is a home game for Kansas City, who put on a bad show last week, looking to rebound. So I'm starting DeMarcus Robinson, especially with a hindered Sammy Watkins. I think DeMarcus Robinson picks up a few extra targets this week, and I think he puts up a nice final score. So I'm starting DeMarcus Robinson here versus the Houston Texans. And what about this guy? He might not be flying under the radar anymore, but I don't think everyone's caught on to how good this guy is. I'm starting DJ Chark from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the New Orleans Saints, who have the 12th worst defense overall and give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. DJ Chark has scored 18.4 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 32 fantasy points last week off of 11 targets, and he's averaging 7.4 targets per game, so he's plenty involved in this offense. Probably the number one receiver right now in Jacksonville. He's projected at 9.5 fantasy points here in week 6. This is a home game. He's got a fantastic matchup. This guy's got talent, so I'm starting DJ Chark here versus the New Orleans Saints. Another guy I'm going to start because of the high implied game total in the matchup. He scares me a little though. I'm starting Tyler Boyd from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Baltimore Ravens, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Tyler Boyd is averaging 13.1 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 23 fantasy points last week. He was targeted 14 times. He's averaging 10.4 targets per game on the season. He's on the field for 88% of the snaps and touches the ball 18% of that time. He's projected at 13.5 fantasy points here in week 6. And we've got that 48-point implied total by Vegas. He's got a great matchup. I just worry about Andy Dalton. But they should be trailing most of the game, which means plenty of passes down the field to Tyler Boyd. So I'm starting Tyler Boyd here versus the Baltimore Ravens. Okay, another guy that I'm starting is Larry Fitzgerald from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 3rd worst defense overall and give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Larry Fitzgerald has averaged 12.5 fantasy points per game on the season in an average of 8.8 targets per game. He's projected at 12.7 fantasy points here in week 6, and they're dealing with some injuries. David Johnson was banged up. Christian Kirk missed last week. So Larry Fitzgerald in a home game with a fantastic matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons. I'm starting Larry Fitzgerald here versus Atlanta. Okay, week 6, fantasy football sits. Wide receiver position, I'm going to sit Courtland Sutton from the Denver Broncos playing the Tennessee Titans, who have the 7th best defense overall and give up the 9th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Courtland Sutton has scored 14.2 fantasy points per game on the season. He's been quite a surprise to a lot of people. He's been super productive. He scored 17 fantasy points last week. He's averaging 7.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He's projected at 11.1 fantasy points here in week 6. If you're struggling at depth at wide receiver, go ahead and plug him in. But if you got better options, I don't like the matchup versus Tennessee Titans. Vegas only thinks there's going to be 38.5 points in this game, so that's a low game total. So I'm going to sit Courtland Sutton here versus the Tennessee Titans. Another guy I'm going to sit is Emmanuel Sanders from the Denver Broncos playing the Tennessee Titans. We've talked about the Tennessee Titans' good defense in that low projected scoring total. On top of that, Emmanuel Sanders hasn't been that great this year. I think it's mostly due to poor quarterback play, but he only got 1 fantasy point last week. He had a 2 games ago, so he's got a super low floor, a little bit too risky for me right now. So I'm going to sit Emmanuel Sanders versus that tough Tennessee Titans defense. Another guy I'm going to sit is Nelson Agholor from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 5th best defense overall, and they're pretty good versus wide receivers. Nelson Agholor has averaged 8.9 fantasy points per game on the season, and he scored 0 and 3 fantasy points after putting up that big 19 fantasy point day. That was mostly due to injury to Alshon Jeffrey, but Jeffrey's back now, and it's putting Nelson Agholor on the back burner. He's only projected at 8.7 fantasy points here in week 6, only a projected total of 44 points scored in that game. Not a great matchup, so I'm going to sit Nelson Agholor here versus the Minnesota Vikings. And another wide receiver I'm going to sit this week is Adam Humphries from the Tennessee Titans playing the Denver Broncos, who give up the 4th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Humphries hasn't been that great this year, only averaging 4.4 fantasy points per game on the season. He only scored 5 fantasy points and 3 fantasy points the game before that, only averaging 4.2 targets per game. He's projected at 5.6 fantasy points here in week 6, low game total of 38.5, tough matchup versus Denver, so I'm going to sit Adam Humphries here in week 6.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks.
Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups. Okay, fantasy football, week 6, sit 'em, start 'em, tight end position. I'm going to start Austin Hooper from the Atlanta Falcons playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have the 2nd worst defense overall and give up the absolute most fantasy points to the tight end position. Austin Hooper is averaging 13.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 8.4 targets per game. He's projected at 10.2 fantasy points here in week 6. He's emerging as one of the elite tight ends in this 2019 fantasy football season. He's got an amazing matchup versus the Cardinals. In a 52-point implied total in this game, Falcons favored by 2. This is one of my favorite tight end starts of the week, so I'm starting Austin Hooper here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Another guy I'm going to start is Will Dissly from the Seattle Seahawks playing the Cleveland Browns, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. They gave up a touchdown to Kittle on Monday night, and Will Dissly is averaging 12.5 fantasy points per game on the season. Consistent production. He's getting 5.2 targets per game. He's projected at 18.5 fantasy points here in week 6. There's an implied game total of 47 points, and I think this might change throughout the week, but they've got the Cleveland Browns favored by 2.5. I don't agree with that. I think Seattle will take this game, but they think it's going to be close. The Browns looked really bad versus the 49ers, but different game, different week, bounce back spot for Cleveland. I think Will Dissly gets a ton of work here, so I'm going to start Will Dissly here versus the Cleveland Browns. Another tight end that I'm going to start is Jared Cook from the New Orleans Saints playing the Jacksonville Jaguars. I'm a little hesitant to make this start, but tight ends is a thin position. So if you're looking for a tight end, this guy might not be a bad option this week. Jared Cook is facing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have the 8th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing tight ends. Jared Cook has averaged 5 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 12 fantasy points last week, so finally a little life for Jared Cook. He's averaging 5 targets per game. He got 6 last week. He's on the field for 64% of the snaps, so he's out there running routes. He's projected at 5.6 fantasy points here in week 6. Only go here if you need him, but I think Jared Cook can put together another good fantasy game, so I'm starting Jared Cook here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Okay, week 6, fantasy football, tight end, sits. I'm going to sit Gerald Everett from the LA Rams, playing that tough San Francisco defense, who has the third best defense overall, and they give up the fifth fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. Gerald Everett is averaging 7.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting 5.2 targets per game. He got 11 targets last game, put up 17 fantasy points. But I'm not going to go point chasing here. He's only projected at 4.6 fantasy points here in week 6. It's a tough matchup versus a really good San Francisco defense. So I'm going to sit Gerald Everett here versus the San Francisco 49ers. Another guy I'm going to sit is Jason Witten from the Dallas Cowboys, playing the New York Jets, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, but they give up the 7th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Jason Witten is averaging 7.2 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 4 targets per game, but he's fallen off a little bit here. Only scored 4 fantasy points last week. He's projected at 6.5 fantasy points here in week 6. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43.5 points scored in this game. They've got Dallas ahead by 8.5. Could be a lot of Ezekiel Elliott running over the Jets. So I'm going to sit Jason Witten here versus the New York Jets.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite
Player for this NFL slate.
I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.